This and all the free content of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Become a patron today and help support the show while getting exclusive content made just for you. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. And we thank you in advance.
How was everybody this afternoon?
Very good.
Good. On behalf of the National Park Service, I'll say we're so grateful that you're here. We're very grateful that you're here in person. For those of you watching online, thank you for carving out some time in your day to participate in this installment of the Winter Lecture Series. As you look around, it may not look like it, but we're actually at capacity today, given our COVID protocols. So this is the first time that's happened since we've reinaugurated these series. So again, very, very grateful to you all, and I'm most especially grateful to our guest for this installment of the Winter Lecture Series, Ty Seidule. I'm going to read your CV, sir, to introduce you here, so I want to be accurate. Dr. Seidule is a brigadier general, retired in the United States Army, where he served nearly 4 decades, including in locales such as Kosovo, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and many, many others. He is currently the the Chamberlain Fellow at Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. Prior to that, he served a distinguished career as a professor of history at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Most importantly, he's here today because he is the author of this book, Robert E. Lee and Me, A Southerner's Reckoning with the Myth of the Lost Cause, which was published in 2020, I believe, so last year. I will also add that he has been incredibly generous with his time, with his expertise. He actually left early to be here so he didn't get caught in the snow somewhere in upstate Pennsylvania. So on that note, please join me in welcoming. What I thought we would do this afternoon is have a fairly informal conversation about not just your book, but your experience growing up in the South, your identity as a Southerner, a scholar, a soldier, and how that led to the creation of Robert E. Lee and Me. And I'd like to begin, General Seidule, the same way that you begin the book. And that's in 2015 with a video that you do for PragerU. And PragerU is a right-leaning social media content producer, I guess is the best way to describe it. And you do a short 5-minute video for them about the causes of the American Civil War. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Great. Well, Chris, thank you for having me, and thank for the Gettysburg Foundation for supporting me, and thank all of you for coming. This is like my second in-person book talk, even though the book's been out a year. So it's great to see everybody. Thank you so much for coming. So I guess it was 2014, we had a book come out, The West Point History of the Civil War, and I was doing some publicity for that. And I did some radio interviews, and the publicist came and said, hey, they want you to do a video on the cause of the Civil War. And I said, well, easy peasy. But can I, do I have complete control of what I can say? And so I went on the site and I looked at a few history ones, and they said, there was somebody on there, historian / priest from Notre Dame, who said that the bomb, talked about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I said, okay, I can do this. And I did it in late 2014, but they had these swooping graphics and everything else, so it didn't come out until a month or 2 months after the massacre of black churchgoers in Charleston by a white supremacist. So what I thought was and I did it in my Blue Army uniform. I didn't think anything of it, but when I started it, I said that why is this a controversial statement? It's because the citizens of the southern states in 1860 and 61 were willing to fight and die to preserve the morally repugnant institution of slavery. And there really is no other cause. It's like great real estate, right? There are 3 reasons for that's real estate prices: location, location, location. And the reason for the Civil War is slavery, slavery, slavery. So I said this, but what I didn't realize was that, holy cow, did it start a firestorm. So it went viral. Turns out the Army does not like officers going viral. And this is not like, so the Army investigated me for political speech for saying the Civil War was about slavery. The thing's had like 30 million views now, and I got hate. Not only did I get hate mail to my West Point public email address, I got death threats to an Army officer for saying that the Civil War is about slavery. And there was it's a whole website making fun of my looks, which my son found and sent to me. It turns out that that I have a face made for radio. As the great Fred Allen once said. Yes, and as the jokes went, we really know there are aliens because they really, Area 51 is real because the feds failed to lock the gate. Or this guy, that's one good one. The other one is that guy doesn't have a 4-head, he has a 5-head. So what I realized from this, though, after all the jokes and everything, and being investigated, I thought my Army career was over, is that history is dangerous. It's dangerous because it goes after our myths and our identities. And when somebody goes after that myth and challenges it, the reaction can be ferocious.
So when the things that you said on that video, they're not necessarily new ideas, right? I mean, many scholars for decades have been saying the same thing. Why do you think it struck such a nerve when you did it, though? Was it the Army uniform, or was it the fact that here's a white guy saying it?
Yes, above. Yes to all above. So I think it mattered that the timing mattered a month after the Charleston massacre. I think it mattered that I was a middle-aged white guy. I think it mattered that I was in my blue Army uniform as a colonel in the Army at the time. It mattered that I was associated with West Point. And it mattered that I wasn't some liberal professor and some saying that this was, and I provided cognitive dissonance for people, I think, when I did this. So I think that's why it did it. And I also think I think the language is strong. It's just I brook no. It's just this is definitely what it is. So yeah, and people weren't ready to hear that. Many people.
Besides the investigation that the Army conducted into you, was there any other fallout from that professionally, from the military?
Yes. The Nation, which is a left-leaning organization, said I was a propagandist for the military. Stars and Stripes said that I was too close to a right-wing political organization. And certainly at West Point, my bosses there looked at me like I was a troublemaker. So yeah, it certainly did not help me in my Army career.
Was it that experience that was the impetus for you to go ahead and write this book?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. So the first one is, I'm a historian, so I can't say yes or no answers today. It's always a story. And the story is, so I was chair of the Memorialization Committee at West Point, and we were really reeling from the 100 graduates who had died in the War on Terror from West Point. And just to put that in context, in Yale, in World War I, had 10 times the number of casualties killed in World War I than West Point did. In the War on Terror, West Point had over 100 killed, Yale 0. So we were really feeling the effects, and there wasn't one place to put them. So as chair of the Memorialization Committee, I had this idea that in our memorial hall, we'd put one room that had the list of those who, as Lincoln would say, gave the last full measure of devotion from the War of 1812 through the War on Terror. So I got all that ready, got the money, got the design, we knew where it was going to go, but one thing was a problem. Should those who were in Confederate gray, West Point graduates in gray who died for the Confederacy, go in the memorial room at the United States Military Academy? And I argued strenuously, vociferously, no, because they abrogated their oath, they killed U.S. Army soldiers, they fought against their country to destroy their country for the worst possible reason, to create a slave republic. And if that wasn't enough, the purpose of the building that was the anti-Confederate George Washington Cullom gave the money for this. He was superintendent at West Point during the war, and said, I will never forgive those who forgot the flag to follow false God. And the law says no unworthy subject should go in there. So I slam dunk. So I go in there to talk to the assorted people on the academic board who look mainly like me. This is West Point's sort of decision-making body, and say, give all that argument. Man, fact. I was like a machine gun of facts. I talk fast, I get it all out. And they said, no, we want to bring people together. We don't want this to be like the Sunni and the Shia fighting for centuries, which is the worst historical analogy in the history of the world, I might add. And I lost. So they voted to put them in. Now, eventually, things happened. They ended up not doing it. So I went, tail between my legs, back to talk to my wife, Sherry, who's in the audience here today, and said, Sherry, I had this brilliant argument about why Confederates shouldn't go in, and they didn't listen to me. She said, well, Ty, did you tell them why you're so passionate about this? Did you tell them your story? I said, no. I did not tell them my story because historians tell other people's stories. They don't tell their own. And so what she did was say, listen, if you're going to be honest about this, you got to tell your own story. And that's what I eventually did at Washington and Lee. So the idea of this really came because I was unsuccessful getting the facts straight any other way except telling it through my own story.
So you mentioned Washington and Lee, and I want to get there in a little bit. But I want to start off with your story a little bit earlier. And you have a line in the book saying that you grow up in Alexandria, Virginia. You consider yourself a Southerner,
right?
Even though I think some today would argue about whether or not Alexandria is actually the South. But you say growing up on a scale of the Spinal Tap scale of 1 to 10.
Right.
Robert E. Lee's an 11, and Jesus Christ is about a 5.
Right.
So can you explain that for us?
Yeah. So I grew up on the so Alexandria. Remember it used to be part of D.C. up until 1847. When it retroceded, it left D.C. in 1847 to protect the slave trade. Alexandria in the 1950s, so it was the major slave trading hub in Northern Virginia, in that Maryland, D.C. area. In the 1950s, it passed a law to name every north-south street after a Confederate as a reaction to integration. When I was bused across town from the white school, Douglas MacArthur, to the segregated black school. What was the name of the segregated black school? Robert E. Lee Elementary. So this was the outpost of the Bird Machine. The massive resistance was in Alexandria. So every part of my life didn't make me think that Lee was good. It was reverential. That was what the Southern, and remember, when I say Southerner, the white is usually silent. Southerner, the white is silent. So it's a white Southern culture. But often we say Southerner and we leave the white part out. Because remember, 30 to 40% of the South is black Americans. But it was reverential. So whether it was at Episcopal High School, which we knew that descendants of Lee were there. It had a big monument to Confederates there. The big prize was after that. The headmaster that was there was a grandson of a Confederate veteran. The Confederacy they were the noble. They lost, but they were noble. So yeah, every part of my life. And my dad used to say, our funny last name, Seidule. He would say, "Yeah, my name is Jim Seidule." That rhymes with Robert E. Lee, my hero. So I had the Confederate flags above the mantelpiece. So certainly in my life, among the white Southerners that I knew, Lee was the paragon. It was reverential. Jesus was somebody you had to go to talk to on Sunday. I had to go to church on Sunday, but Lee he was who you wanted to be.
And your birthday is?
Oh, my birthday is July 3rd. Anybody, maybe some people in the audience know that July 3rd has some meaning here at Gettysburg. So yeah, I wanted to be born on 4th of July, an all-American boy. But I was so close. But then I found out that Pickett's Chargers that day. Like, here's something. I'm linked to Lee now.
And even though, Pickett's Chargers, not a military success, as we would say, you still connected with Lee because of the fact that your birthday happened to fall on that.
Yeah, this was so crazy about Pickett's Charge. It's a suicidal charge, all right? It's an absolute disaster. And yet, Burnside gets just crucified for his disaster at Fredericksburg. Grant gets crucified for his disaster at Cold Harbor, and even the one, at Vicksburg. So frontal assaults have a bad name when they don't work in the Civil War, but not this one. This one, all we were talking about is Lee accepting blame like a good gentleman. So yeah, even though it was a disaster, this lost cause mythology really created that Lee was the gentleman. This was this whole idea of what a gentleman is, and I tell you, I have trouble describing myself as that anymore because it does have both racial and misogynist undertones. Like the white gentleman is the top of the patriarchal class. It's the top up here, and everybody else is kind of below. And that's why I loved it. Why I love Lee. It's the top. It's the most status is attributed to him.
Growing up, and you write in the book how this desire on your part to be this Southern Christian gentleman. Growing up, did you make those connections, or was it just this is what a young white boy growing up in Virginia was supposed to do?
Does a fish know it's in water? It was the milieu that I was in that you wanted to be a gentleman. You wanted to be an educated Christian gentleman wearing a blue blazer and a rep tie and khakis and Weegians, and you wanted that status. I wanted status. And status is a form of power. So yeah, I wanted that. I wanted as a young kid. I wanted status, and that was in my culture. That's where the status that I saw anyway. Mm-hmm. That's where because my dad was a teacher, prep school teacher, and the boys had that were there, and the people that were there. That's how they equated it. At least at Episcopal High School when I was growing up.
So I got some images I'm going to share here if I can.
Oh.
So in the book, you mentioned a couple of texts that are very impactful to you at an early age. And one is Meet Robert E. Lee, and the other, and I pulled out a page from one of the textbooks that you had, I believe in Alexandria.
Yes.
So when you see these, can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I sure can. So the one on your left is the 7th grade textbook for the state of Virginia. The state of Virginia created purposely that Harry, the bird machine, which controlled Virginia, as part of massive resistance. Remember, Virginia led the league in massive resistance to integration. When 1948 came and Truman starts the Civil Rights Commission, based on the lynching, particularly of African American veterans, he starts that, and the white South goes crazy about this. They just go insane. And Virginia wants to know: are we making sure that we're teaching young white and black kids in Virginia that segregation is good? And the best way to say segregation is good is, and this is the quote: can we make slavery look as good as possible? And so that's what the 4th, 7th, and 11th grade text that the state of Virginia forces the schools to have. And the picture on the left is showing a family that has just come off the Middle Passage from Africa, entering into what they call social security system. And what it's trying to show is that there you can see the white colonial guy, hand on the shoulder, the woman, oh, thank goodness someone's going to take care of us. This is going into perpetual bondage for generation after generation, and it looks like they're coming off a Princess Cruise line. That's what it looks like. And so the evil, and you can even see the white sailor with like a little tattoo on there. That's the low class, right? But the planter class, how erect he is, the clothes he's in, this is an educated Christian gentleman. That's what he's trying to show you. So this was the book that everybody in the South had through the 70s. If you're in the state of Virginia, that's what it had. On your right is Meet Robert E. Lee, my favorite chapter book. And you'll notice in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see the little lion, the little step-up orange lion. And if you open up the book, then it says, there's a 2nd grade teacher that says, hey, we love these because it's for inquiring minds. It's kids want to know more. And there's a little quote that says, I love them, from Steve Meyer, 2nd grade, Chicago. This was published a year after King's assassination. Written, in fact, by a Harvard-educated Connecticut Yankee. But it says that Lee was the finest gentleman ever. He and Washington were the last men of old Virginia. And there were 2 African Americans that are in these pictures. One picture, he is a coach driver, an enslaved driver, one black man, and the others were crazed assassins during John Brown's raid. And those are the only 2 depictions on there. It wasn't anything about slavery. It's about Lee being the great gentleman. And I just ate that stuff up. And so and then the 3rd book would have been Gone with the Wind, which I read when I was in sixth grade, and I read it again. And if you read it now, it is just awful. It's just awful. The depiction of racism, of lost cause, of just horrible. And that was, those were the books that really meant a lot to me as a kid growing up.
Did you have a lot of interaction? As you mentioned, you go to Robert E. Lee School. Is it elementary?
Elementary, yeah.
Did you have a lot of interaction with black students, African American students?
Yes.
Were you siloed?
Yes. No, well, I think when I lived in Virginia, my last couple of years there, so my dad was there when we integrated Episcopal High School. Mm-hmm. It was one of the last Episcopal schools to integrate in the country. But it did, 68, 69. And so we had black kids coming over to the house. I remember, we would watch, whatever the Good Times one I remember watching with they were a little bit older than me that would come to our house. So, and I remember my dad coaching the black kids there, but it was pretty much tokenism that was coming there at Episcopal. And then I remember going to Robert E. Lee. It's the only time in my life, I think, that I had a black teacher and a black principal was when I was at Lee Elementary School. And I ran for president that year in the school, and I lost 40 to 60%, 60% black kids, 40% white. And then I became part of the white flight movement. So when I was in Georgia, when I lived for high school, I did not realize it was 50% African American in that town. The only time I saw black people was my summer job at an egg processing factory. And there I was one of the few white folks there. And of course, very few at Washington and Lee as well. It's in the Army that we really began to see black people as particularly, and in the Army I had black bosses routinely. My last boss before I left the Army was a black boss. So routinely had them in the Army, and I think that's part of what changed me.
It's kind of I don't know, it's probably a difficult question to answer, but did you consider yourself racist then?
Oh, no, I would not have considered myself racist.
Do you consider yourself, looking back on your experiences now, you say, oh, yes, I was racist?
I think, yes, I was. I think that, racism is the virus in the American dirt. It is our eternal pandemic. And so I think most people are affected by this unless you are actively working not to. It just is. And, of course, it's not just the South. the most segregated cities in the country are now in the north and west. So, that's what housing policy did by the Federal Housing Administration. Social Security excluded black people when it first started. VA loans, GI Bill, redlining, real estate agents. So I would not, I didn't think I was at the time, but looking back, my experiences were that I don't think that my culture embraced equality as it should have.
So ultimately, you go down to Georgia, and then you make the decision to go to Washington and Lee University for school. Can you give us some insight into, out of all the places you could have gone, a bright young guy, you settle on Washington and Lee. Can you tell us a little bit about that decision?
I'm still figuring that one out. So because I'm a straight white guy going to an all-male school, the closest women's colleges are an hour away, and I don't have a car.
So it is still all-male?
No, it's not. It was when I was there.
When you attended? Yeah.
When I attended, it was all-male. And it was probably at its valley. It is a first-rate liberal arts college now, really, really good. Because it went co-ed a couple of years after I left, and but it was at its trough when I was there in the 80s. This was also the Animal House era, fraternities era, so strong, which is I'm not a fan. Thank goodness we don't sort of have those at Hamilton College, which is a jewel of a liberal arts school. Full plug there for Hamilton College. Go Continentals. But I went there because I wanted to leave Georgia. I wanted to get out of the Deep South. I knew that rural Georgia was not me. But I looked at Duke, I looked at Davidson, I looked at Sewanee, I looked at all the places that a status-seeking white Southern kid would want to go to. And I went to W&L and I saw that same status that I saw at Episcopal. Yeah. I saw the young men dressed in the same way. It looked like almost like a collegiate terra, with those big, the colonnade, the grass, and the young men who were talking to me. They'd hear status. I could feel it there. So I went there, and the ideal of Lee it still appealed to me. He's still there on that Spinal Tap scale, still an 11 for me.
We had Tony Horwitz before he passed away.
Oh gosh, yes.
Here to do something very similar. And in his book Confederates in the Attic, Horwitz writes about how Richmond is kind of like the Confederate Mecca, but Lexington might be Medina. And I'd argue, I think Gettysburg is right up there too.
I think you're right.
Your time at Washington and Lee, though, did you find that to be the case?
Oh, totally.
You kind of alluded to it already.
Yeah, totally. So if you go in at Lee Chapel, for instance, now, by the way, they just oh yeah, there it is. Well done. Nice. 1,000 bonus points. So if you look at that, so if you go into Lee Chapel, it's now University Chapel. They just renamed it. But then Lee Chapel, you go in there, and it is a shrine. It was the Shrine of the South. That's what they called it. They used to have the license plate, Virginia license plate. If you lived in Rockbridge County, said Shrine of the South. That's what it used to say on there. And tourism was about this. Washington Lee called it the Westminster Abbey of the Confederacy. And if you go in there, I'm a raised Episcopalian. I know my way around a church. I was a head acolyte for 2 years. So I know my way. You go in there, and it looks like every chapel that's built in the 19th century, or every church, Episcopalian church, except for a couple things. It's missing a pulpit. It's missing where the hymnals are laid. It's missing a couple of those things. But it has an apse. The apse is the Holy of the Holies, and it has an altar. And in that altar on that altar is Robert E. Lee. Why white? White for his purity. White for what he was fighting for, the white people of the South. And he's in his battlefield. He's in his uniform, asleep on the battlefield, not dead. He's buried below, and his hand is on the saber. And if you look right there, the seal is the state of Virginia. He belongs to the state. And it is a holy place. And I knew people that were there that would go to genuflect before St. Bob if they had some problem that they were thinking about. There was a woman who got married there in the 90s that said, I chose it because it was the most sacred space I knew. It was sacred. And so, yeah, this was absolutely still General Lee's College. It was General Lee's College. That's the name of the history book about it, is General Lee's College. The thing is now it's not General Lee's College. I think it is fighting for it. It's fighting for what does this school going to mean now. And I hope it will choose that it's not General Lee's College because it's a fine institution now. But if you go in there, and I don't know if we want to talk about that now, but that's where I was commissioned.
Yeah.
So in fact, I received my commission. I took an ROTC scholarship. I was broke. My parents got divorced. I had no money. So I took one of these. They were giving them out like Pez during the Reagan era. Didn't want to go in. Army was for miscreants. That's what my family told me, but I didn't have any money. So, and it took me 36 years to get out. So I love the Army. But so I went in there. There's a picture of me back with hair, waiting in my green uniform next to this beatified picture of Lee, and then I go get my commission right in front of this. Go back, and then I raise my right hand and give the oath of office. How many of you served in federal government or veterans have taken that oath of office before? Anybody ever taken that oath of office? Okay. I did too, to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and bear true faith and allegiance to the same. Sound familiar? What I didn't realize then when I took those surrounded by Confederate flags is that oath was written in 1862. It is an anti-Confederate oath. When it says enemies, foreign and domestic, it's talking about Confederates. That used to be the ironclad oath. The ironclad oath, which the first part was a background check. Were you ever with those traitorous Confederates? The last part, which we take today, was the promissory note. And in 1884, they got rid of the first part and kept the second part. So I took an anti-Confederate oath to serve the United States of America surrounded by Confederate flags.
Did you recognize the irony of that at the time? Or is this only later that you...
Chris. I recognized nothing. I thought it was absolutely appropriate. It was absolutely appropriate. America. This is great American. This is this great American. This person who is a great military hero. And in fact, so if you right out here, if you imagine there and there's a picture of Lee in Confederate gray, and here's a picture of Washington in British red. It was his French and Indian War picture. So neither one of them was in the Army blue. Remember, the blue color that we wear, that Ulysses S. Grant wore, was chosen by Washington because Washington was a clothes horse. He loved that. He chose blue for the U.S. Army. Same blue he wore, that Grant wore, that I wore for nearly 4 decades. So yeah, no, I had no clue how ironic until I studied that oath, and then I went, oh my God, I took an anti-Confederate oath. Surrounded by, and when did those Confederate flags leave? 2014, because of the protests of black law students at W.N.
You know, in part I keep asking the question because I'm waiting for, your moment of catharsis, right? Where
yes.
The light bulb turns on.
Yes.
Probably my favorite part of the book is when you bring your wife into Lee Chapel.
Yes, yes.
And you'll do a better job of telling that story, but she sees a very different thing when she looks at that statue of Lee.
Yes.
Can you go into that a little bit?
Sherry, what did you say when you saw that?
Get me out of here.
So I don't know if they heard it, but basically what she said is, get me out of here. Her dad went to VMI for a year and then went to West Point, graduated in 1953. And his hero was George Thomas. He's a Virginian, was from Portsmouth, and taught, Sherry's one of 5 girls, and taught them that Lee was a traitor. Now, how she was able to overcome that and marry me is a topic for a different lecture, a different time. But she certainly said, she said, get me out of here. And we went back later and with our kids, and she was still. I showed because if you go down below in Lee Chapel, it's a reliquary. We were stationed in Naples for 2 years, and we used to go to all these churches in the southern part, and they had the bones to their saint, the remains of their saints, and there'd be these old men and women whispering prayers to them. And that's what Lee Chapel was like. They had the Lee and Traveler sock puppets, little finger puppets there. Traveler is buried outside, and Traveler buried outside. The people still leave apples and carrots on his ghostly voyage with his master, and they put pennies. Why pennies? They put pennies face down on Traveler's grave so that so that Lee can't see the hated Lincoln's face, and so that Lincoln will have to kiss Traveler's butt. True story. So we haven't got there yet, but remember, this all stuff has a pernicious purpose. There's a purpose to this stuff. There's a purpose.
You graduate Washington Lee. You're now in the United States Army, and you end up traveling the world. But you spend a number of time at various military bases, a large number of which are named for Confederate officers. A number who served at Gettysburg, so Fort Benning, Fort Hood, Fort Lee, Fort Pickett. And there's a number of United States military bases named after Fort Gordon, named after John B. Gordon, who never actually even served in the United States military. As you're traveling around these bases, did that, you write a lot about it in your book, but I'm wondering when you kind of connected the dots and were like, hey, that's kind of curious.
Yeah, way too late. Way too late. The idea that these people that we named them after were the enemy that they were part of an insurrectionist force that killed U.S. Army soldiers. They were part of a force that did not accept the results of a democratic election and chose armed rebellion instead. It didn't penetrate for years, for decades even. I saw them as either, but what's interesting is you go to those places, and I was at Bragg, Benning, particularly, the most of those, and you go there, they never tell you who they are. There's no thing there that says, oh, here's who Bragg is. Yeah. Because you can't. Who would you want? Would you want to tell the story of Braxton Bragg and try to inspire young soldiers with Braxton Bragg? Would you want to tell the story of John Brown Gordon, who shot 5 times at Antietam? I mean, a great soldier, no doubt about it, probably the best of the non-professionally trained soldiers, certainly in the Confederacy, but also one who in 1868 gave a talk to black Charlestonians. This is after the war, and said, listen, black people of Charleston, if you demand equality, the 40 million of us, white people, will exterminate the 4 million of you in a race war. He led the Ku Klux Klan. He was a white supremacist governor and senator for the rest of his days. And this is who we named it for. The idea that we named them for the enemy, people that killed U.S. Army soldiers, is just outrageous to me. But I did not see that for a long, long time.
And it's still, I think, a fairly contentious topic of debate, the renaming of these bases.
It is contentious.
From your perspective as both a scholar but also as a member of the United States military, what is the answer there? Do we rename the bases?
Yes.
We do.
Yes.
Who do we name them after?
Well, I mean, there's a commission ongoing that I'm a member of, and I can't really talk much about that because it's ongoing. But I can't say the law. The law said, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2021 said, create a commission and with the purpose of changing, modifying any asset paraphernalia even that commemorates those who voluntarily served in the Confederacy or the Confederacy. And then it gave till the end of 2022 to September 30th of 2022 to come up with recommendations, and then told the Secretary of Defense to implement it by the end of 2023.
Okay, so you think we'll see that within the next few years then?
I do.
Do you have any idea?
It's the law.
Without delving too deep into that, in various other interviews you've done in your book, you highlight some individuals that you think would be good representatives of where America currently is, what America should look like to be honored with a base named after them. Do you still think about who should we?
Yeah, I certainly do, but I don't want to go into that because that's something that we're deliberating as part of the commission, so I don't feel comfortable doing that. I did write an article that you're welcome to look at in the Washington Post in June of 20, where I came up with 11 names. To do that. And if you gave me an hour, I could come up with another 11. And if you gave me an hour after that, I could come up with another 11. There's so many, this is soldiers because it's an Army issue really. There's so many soldiers that served the nation with honor, that served this country in the uniform of the U.S. Army. We have, and I know you could tell them, whether it's from this battlefield or from Incheon or from Da Nang or from anywhere that, or for Fallujah or Cop Keating, you could name anywhere. There are so many soldiers that as Lincoln said, gave the last full measure of devotion, or any other way that you want to look at it. So I'm extraordinarily excited that the Army, which is the most diverse workforce in our country, that we can make sure that those people that we commemorate represent the values, courage of the United States Army. And so that gives me great pride that the nation is going to do it. Remember, this isn't the Army doing it. It's the nation deciding through its elected representatives to make that change. So I'm just very, and it was a supermajority that overrode President Trump's veto to create that commission and to sign the National Defense Authorization Act of 2021.
Does that law also apply to the West Point Military Academy?
Anything that's part of DOD.
Okay, so it does. So you end up going to West Point.
Yes.
Where you study, or you're a professor of history. I assume you staff rides, all kinds of stuff. And you're confronted with some of the same iconography at West Point that you see at Fort Benning and Fort Bragg. Can you go into that a little bit? And was that, at this point, not strange to you? It was, of course.
This became strange very quick. I mean, then there are a couple things that have changed in me before that. One is as you've already known, the hero of my book is my wife, Sherry. who is the most honest person I know. And I grew up in a culture that lied. It was a lying culture because it was a culture that was based, I was born into a racial police state, an apartheid state, where black people were relegated to second-class citizens. They couldn't vote. Remember, we've only been a democracy in this nation for about 50 years. So I grew up in that environment. And my wife, she's incapable of lying, so she changed me. My time as an Army officer changed me, and then a time as a historian, as a scholar. So we're living on Lee Road by Lee Gate and Lee Housing area in West Point. I'm walking one day past our barracks, and our barracks at West Point named after our finest soldiers in American military history. So, you could argue with them, but there's Scott Winfield, there's Scott Barracks, MacArthur, Washington, Eisenhower, Pershing, Sherman, and then I go by, and there's Grant, and I go by Grant Hall, and one after Grant Hall is Lee Barracks. And I look at that and I go, damn, why is that here? I understood Washington Lee University. Sure. And then I go look east about 20 yards to this new Reconciliation Plaza that has Lee, that was put up in 2001, has Lee as well on that. And I go around Campus Post, looking, and I find over a dozen memorials. So I went, how the heck does this happen? I said, well, and I asked my boss, who's at the time the memorialization chair, he didn't know. Nobody cared. And I said, well, this was like 2007 or 8 or something. I said, well, I know how to fix that. So I start going back and looking. And what I found, which was so extraordinary, is that, at least I thought at the time, because I didn't start out as a Civil War historian, is in right after the Civil War, I thought, well, they'll probably starting this in 1870 when Lee dies. The bond of West Point will bring them together is so important. No, in the 19th century, in fact, West Point banished the Confederates as traitors. None in our cemetery, none on Battle Monument, our great 70-foot monuments. It says the War of the Rebellion. None in our Memorial Hall. Duty, honor, country, our famous motto, 1898, country. It's an anti-Confederate monument. So then I think, when did this come about? So I go back, I write that up, I put a journal article about Civil War memory at West Point. Then I start figuring this stuff out. Well, when's the first come? Lee first comes back in the 1930s. Okay, that's Lee Road, Lee Gate, all these things. Then there's a portrait of Lee in Confederate gray with an enslaved servant in the background, 1951. Then Lee Barracks, early 1970s. Like, what? And so I start, context. Well, it turns out the 1930s when the first black cadet comes back to West Point after 50 years. 1951, the Army is fighting against desegregating. Truman has ordered it in Executive Order 9981, and the Army is slow rolling it. It's fighting it. 2 secretaries of the Army are from North Carolina. They're slow rolling it. The Second Army orders that portrait. 1971, that is the year after minority admissions start, and West Point goes from a tokenism, a handful of cadets a year, to dozens of cadets a year. So I scratch a Confederate monument at West Point, and it's a reaction to integration. Other Confederate monuments are to celebrate the white supremacy victory, sort of the Redeemer movement of all the southern states that redo their state constitutions, like Virginia, which says, of course, this is what Carter Glass says, of course we're fighting for white supremacy. That's the whole point of redoing the state constitutions, to ensure that white people have control over black people. This is the different side of the same coin, which is, how do you react against integration? Confederate memorialization is one way of doing that. And that just tears me up. And that is what really what changes me from being just a historian to be, because I'm a historian activist, I think these things should change.
And so you're still obviously in the United States military at this time. You do staff rides, and there's a line in your book that I think really resonated with me. And I think it should resonate with anyone who does battlefield interpretation. You said, quote, "Don't let the smell of gunpowder overwhelm our senses." What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so the smell of gunpowder seduced me. So I would get on these battlefields, Antietam, Gettysburg, and I would talk about the X's and O's of military history. Like at the Bloody Lane, talking about John Brown Gordon. Or Pickett's Charge, or I'm in the Peach Orchard, and I looked at this, but I didn't start it by saying, here's the purpose of this war, and it's not equal. We can't remember the two sides are not equal. One side, United States of America, fighting to retain this. One side is a slaving army. It's fighting for slavery, it is not only fighting for slavery, it is fighting, and I think that's the thing that I bring this up right now, which is remember that Lee's army, when it comes to Gettysburg, is not only, it is enslaving people. And so its logistics is slavery. It is an enslaved logistics, 8,000 that are coming, following him into Gettysburg. And he wants more. God, Jefferson Davis or Seddon's, get me more enslaved labor. Get me more enslaved labor so I can put more of the white men fighting. That's what he's doing. And then when he comes here, he scatters the black population of Harrisburg and everywhere else, because everywhere his army goes, they capture black people to bring them back further south for sale. So this is, in my opinion, this is an evil army doing evil things for an evil purpose. And if I only look at the military history part of the X's and O's, I lose that fundamental difference between the blue side that I wore, the United States of America, and the enemy.
I think this relates to that. In your book, you go into some detail about the importance of names and what we call things. And so, for example, you won't use the term, or you don't like to use the term Union soldiers, which we use at Gettysburg all the time. I mean, the museum, the waysides, that's how we refer to the United States Army that fought here. Go into a little bit about what you find problematic with that.
Yeah. So when I'm at West Point and I go into the cemetery, I've never seen the word Union on a tombstone. Never seen the word Union on any of the plaques in Cullom Hall. Below, that we have this amazing ballroom that has all the portraits of the Civil War generals, the U.S. Army Civil War generals. And they look down on you in this great ballroom. In fact, that ballroom is where Sherry's father met Sherry's mother. He's from, going to West Point, she's from Queens. They meet at a hop at a dance there and marry 4 years later. And so in that ballroom, these portraits look down on you like, if not for the United States Army, there would be no United States of America. And as I'm looking at that, I realize this Union term does not describe the people wearing the same blue uniform that I do. It makes it seem as though it's an army, as Karl Marx would say, in the dustbin of history. That it fought only one war, and it never fought another war. No, that's the United States Army that fought the same blue uniform with the same buttons that I wore on my dress uniform for 35 years, 8 months, and a day. It's the same one that George Washington wore. And by saying Union, you miss that fundamental difference that this is the United States Army, my army, and you miss the idea that Confederates are killing U.S. Army soldiers. And so, to me, you've got to keep that fundamental difference. And I will tell this again and again. I am a soldier. I'm a scholar, but I'm also a soldier. I'm a United States Army soldier. It's what I did for the majority of my life. I will always be a soldier for life is what we call it in the Army, a soldier for life. And as a soldier for life, I like people that fight for the United States of America, not those who fight against it.
In 2017, you're invited back to Washington and Lee to give a speech, a talk. And this is, you're at a point in time where there's been significant racial strife, violent racial strife in the United States. 2015, obviously, in Charleston. You're invited back to Washington and Lee, though. And you go back to the Lee Chapel, and you give a speech. Can you go into that? To me, that's kind of I don't know if that's a cathartic moment, but I would imagine for you professionally to be back in that building and to give the talk that you gave must have been an extraordinary moment.
It was. It was. A friend of mine, Ted Delaney, who amazing guy. He was started out at West Point. Started out at W&L as a janitor, as a custodian there. Grew up, he's a black man, grew up segregated Virginia, started as a custodian. 20 years later, he graduates from W&L. Then he finally gets his PhD, comes back, and is now the senior, sort of the professor, the moral conscience of W&L. And he invites me to come. He knows, he's seen that. We've talked, and it's a month after Charlottesville. And I give a talk called Robert E. Lee and Me. And I was, as we say in the military, nervous in the service. Nervous in the service because I had to tell my truth. My truth is that I think Robert E. Lee chose treason to preserve slavery. And so I give this talk standing on top of his grave with this framing me in the background. And I say this. I say that he chose treason to preserve slavery. And I really call on my school, the school W&L, which I'm a proud graduate, that they have to embrace this. They have to figure out how they're going to change from a school that embraced the lost cause to one that is going to no longer do that. And so I tell this story, and they're flaggers in there. Flaggers are, if you know flaggers, they're the ones, neo-Confederates who believe that the Confederate flag should be everywhere. And around Lexington, they put these 90-foot flagpoles around, and they wear their red pants. So they're in the background, and it was scary because this was right after Charlottesville. But what I found is when I told this, and I told my story first. I didn't just say, "Hey, you're all screwed up." I said, "Here's me. I did this, but this is not right anymore." And I was worried. It's an almost white audience. What was the reaction gave? And I was amazed they gave me a standing ovation at W&L, at Washington and Lee, in the Shrine of the South, standing over his tomb. And before I finished the story, I said, people were really uncomfortable. And I said, I hear you. You're uncomfortable. Uncomfortable causes no lasting damage. In fact, uncomfortable is called education. That's what it is. And I look back, and I stop, go back, and I look and say, look, he's still there. No damage. It didn't crack. I wasn't swallowed whole into the ground. There was no lightning that struck me. Uncomfortable is okay. You're okay to be uncomfortable. But imagine, if you will, which you should, what it was like in the enslaved era, knowing that your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents were going into enslavement, knowing that rape was a part of that culture, knowing the pain and suffering of the segregated era. I said, just hearing the fact that Lee was a traitor for slavery, that's uncomfortable, but it's nothing. You can handle it. Americans can handle it, and we'll be a better, more empathetic people if we come to grips with that.
Before we turn it over to the audience for questions, I do want to end the same spot that you end the book, which is with a quote. It's the very last line in your book. And you say, the only way to prevent a racist future is to first understand our racist past. When you think about where the country was in 2015, when you did the PragerU talk, or if you think about where the country was in 2017 when you spoke at Washington Lee, and you look at where we are now in 2022, do you think we're evolving or devolving? Are we on the right trajectory? Are you encouraged or are you discouraged about the progress? Why don't you tell us the story?
I'll tell you a story. So, yes, I'm encouraged. The idea, and Sherry and I went to Richmond recently, and we went and looked at Monument Avenue, all gone. We went and looked at the United Daughters of the Confederacy headquarters. Have anybody ever been to Richmond and know where the United Daughters of the Confederacy headquarters? Right above that, and there's the Robert E. Lee camp of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, a little plaque right there. And looking right above that is Rumor of War, which is this a statue that looks like the Jeb Stuart statue, horse reared back like this, except it's a black man in a hoodie with dreadlocks, Nikes, and torn jeans. This heroic portrait of a black man, and it dominates the UDC headquarters. And then we went into what was the Museum of the Confederacy, now the American Civil War Museum, and it's telling a completely honest story. Then we go into what was the Virginia Historical Society, and that's where the lost cause painting is. That's Lee and Jackson right before Chancellorsville. Massive portrait, and it says this is a lost cause portrait. So it had completely changed. And we went down by, I think, Brown Island maybe, where we saw the Emancipation and Freedom Monument, which shows a proud formerly enslaved woman with her baby here holding up the Emancipation Proclamation, and a formerly enslaved man, chains following with whip marks on his back. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. And then I see others, and for those teachers in the audience, how confusing it must be to be a teacher right now, worried about states passing laws about what you can teach. Mm-hmm. History is dangerous. History is dangerous because it goes after our myths and our identities. But, to quote John Updike, the truth is ruthless. The truth is ruthless, and the writer's job is to sometimes rub humanity's face in the facts. So I know that's what I'm doing sometimes, but I believe in the promise of America. I do believe in this country. I believe that patriotism comes in criticizing. James Baldwin once said that I love my country more than any other, and for that reason, I will criticize her relentlessly. So I love my country, so I'll criticize. So on the one hand, things, yes, amazing, getting better. On the other hand, watch out. We're Americans. That's the story of America. But I know that people doing the right thing and understanding their history will make us a better, more empathetic people. And I do go back to that. If we want to ensure that we don't have a racist future, the best way to do that is to understand our racist past.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Dr. Ty Seidule. A few minutes for questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Questions? Sir.
You mentioned the United Daughters of the Confederacy. How much of an influence were they in your growing up and in the Alexandria and the South overall?
Yeah, great question. So the United Daughters of the Confederacy, probably one of the most successful propagandist machines in the history of the country. Incredibly powerful. They created, which is still around today, the Children of the Confederacy, which was founded in Alexandria, Virginia. And you can look online and find the Confederate Catechism, which the United Daughters of the Confederacy still to this day have children memorize to win scholarship money. And that is, the Civil War wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights. Slaves were happy in their condition. All those things that were written in the 1920s, 1930s. So they are, and I saw them around. I was not a member of the Children of the Confederacy, but everywhere you go in the South, and in fact on this battlefield, oh my gosh, how many United Daughters of the Confederacy monuments are here? A bunch, because Sherry and I went and saw them. Alabama says that. North Carolina says that. So yes, the United Daughters of the Confederacy is in our DNA at this point, and and it will take a heck of a lot of work to get it out.
Thank you.
Sir.
You talked about the speech you gave in Washington and Lee in was that 2017?
Yes.
And this was just, like you said, this was just after everything happened in Charlottesville and places like that. I just want to know what was going through your mind when you gave a speech in front of a altar made to Robert E. Lee, talking about what the university needs to do to change. How nervous were you?
Well, I was, so frankly, I had been through this with the superintendents at West Point, 3-star generals, and they were a lot more scary.
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Because I'll tell the truth.
Go ahead.
I'm more nervous than I've ever seen him in 35 years through wars, through jumping out of airplanes. That was the answer. That's the most nervous I have ever seen him, and more preparation than I have ever seen him go through. And that's saying a lot in 35 years in the military.
Thank you.
Damn, I can't get, yeah, this is true. I tell you, I grew up lying. Lying's in my DNA, and sometimes it's still hard to get out. So luckily, I have, so the truth meter is over here to tell the truth when I sometimes fail. So it's true. It's completely true. No, I mean, I worked the heck out on that speech. I worked it hard to make sure that I was going after Lee and not going after W&L. But I talked about all the times that I mean, I went through and did the research. I really wasn't ready. The book goes much more into Lee than I did there, because I hadn't gone into that. It was telling my story, but then telling traitor. And that's what West Point did. West Point, what I realized in the 19th century, is treason. Remember, Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution, there's only one crime in the Constitution, and that is treason, is levying war against the United States. And I have two witnesses. It's meant to narrow the definition and not political speech. But if anybody, again, he was indicted, not convicted. But so, I mean, saying that there was really I was nervous. I was. And I think I hit it, but I was totally nervous to call Lee a traitor to slavery there, standing on top of his grave. It was nerve-wracking. But I had to tell my truth, too.
Well, God bless you for your courage. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir?
Okay, I don't recall how much you went into this in the book. What is your opinion on Lee as a military commander? Obviously, he lost in the end.
Right. Yeah, well, which is an important thing to remember. So, he didn't just lose by a little bit either. I mean, his army is crushed, destroyed, wiped off the battlefield. The first thing I do is to say, the first thing you got to do when you're remembering about Lee as a commander is, it's an enslaving army for a slave purpose, all of these things. And then I say he's a first-rate commander. The war, and Gary Gallagher says this, which is, he's a great emeritus professor at UVA, that says, what is the turning point? So, we always talk about that. He has a great way of saying it's a 7 days battle. When Lee takes over, and McClellan is 5 miles from Richmond. He takes over and kicks McClellan out. If that doesn't happen, they could take Richmond. The war's over. Slavery still extant. So that victory there really leads to that's what leads to the Emancipation Proclamation. It's already happening at Antietam. It's 7 days that leads to the Emancipation Proclamation, which overturns the war. And he defeats commander after commander after commander. And listen, you can say that they're all terrible, but most Civil War commanders are terrible. Most of them are terrible. I mean, it's really hard after you've been leading this many people to lead this many people. And he defeats Pope, McClellan, Hooker, Burnside. I mean, we can name them all until he gets to. But I will say, but then I say, Grant's better. Grant is the finest soldier to ever wear U.S. Army blue, and Grant is the best commander of the war. He sees at the political, strategic, operational, and tactical that in a way that I don't know any other soldier in our history does other than Grant. So I look at him as, but the purpose we can't forget the purpose of this war is treason for slavery. It is an evil purpose, a nefarious purpose that he is fighting this war, and that always has to come out first.
Yep.
Thanks for your book. Thanks for your courage. My son is in the Army. In your book, you speak eloquently about the Army dealing with a racist past. How do you assess those efforts?
Well, mixed. So I'm going to write my next book on a period in the early 70s. So I'm a Civil War historian. I do it, but I come at it from West Point. So I really have been writing and teaching about West Point for years. And there was an incident in the 1970s where Nixon comes to West Point and orders, and I talk about it a little bit in the book, where he orders a Confederate monument to be put on West Point. And when black cadets find out about this, they write a manifesto and they defeat the president. But what also happens during that time in the early 70s is the Army, the military in general, recognizes that it has a problem with systemic racism. It says we have systemic racism in the Army, and it's from the 4-star generals down to the lowest privates. But it's really black activism that brings it up, and white generals say, we got a problem, and there's no way we're going to be able to fight again after Vietnam unless we fix our racist problem. And so they create a whole system of race relations training, a race relations institute, and what becomes an equal opportunity infrastructure throughout the entire military. It's there to this day. It is the first institution in the world that admits it has a problem with systemic racism and creates a systemic solution. Now, we're Americans, and we have racism is in our DNA, so I'm not saying that it solves the problem, but it is an attempt, and we continue to work at these attempts to do that. So do we still have a problem with racism? We're Americans. We still have a problem with it. We have a problem that we don't have enough senior leaders that our diversity among senior leaders is terrible. But I probably, if I had to say what is the bigger problem in the military, is gender. And the level of sexism which is a subject for a different time, but that is an even bigger issue within the Army. But it's working on. I've talked to the Chief of Staff of the Army last year, and he understands the problem that we have with race, and if you see, right now we have a black superintendent at West Point and at the Air Force Academy. VMI has one, not in the federal government, but at 10th Mountain Division, which is up near us, as a black commanding general. So that's how I look at it. What's the leadership look like? And that is a more work needs to be done there.
Let's see. Sir, wait, right there. Yes, sir.
To your earlier comments about treason, doesn't Lincoln insulate the South from that particular charge by calling it a rebellion?
Yeah, I mean, so, I think that you can, well, yes and no. Certainly the Congress says it's treason. And there are, so if you read, which I have, the congressional testimony through there, they are saying, so as you say, is it levying war? I think that's how you have to say, is this levying? That's what the constitutional definition is. And even if it's a rebellion, I don't see how you can say it's not levying war. If this is war, it's war. Now, and plus, if you think about the Senate during this time, and I looked at the testimony about West Point, and one senator, I don't know if it's James Lane, I'm not sure which one, says on the floor of the Senate, when they talk about closing West Point in 1861, he said West Point, if the Union is to die, it will be because of West Point pro-slaveryism. They said that West Point has more traitors in its midst than any institution since Judas Iscariot.
Wow.
So treason, treason, treason. They all say it during that time. So the idea that I'm saying is treason is not something that is a presentist argument. It's something that everyone was saying throughout that period. So no, I don't think that just because Lincoln said it's a rebellion, and remember, Lee is indicted for treason, as is Jefferson Davis and about 20 others. And there's a great book called Lee's Lost Indictment by a friend of mine, John Reeves, that goes into why it wasn't done. But no, I still think from this soldier's, and all of it is from a soldier's perspective, I think that it fits the constitutional definition of treason.
We have time for one more. I saw your hand, sir.
We've removed a lot of Confederate monuments, paraphernalia from around the country. Do you advocate for removal of Confederate memorials on the battlefield?
Great question. It is interesting, and I think you have to take some examples. The interesting one, let's start not here, but at Manassas. So first of all, Manassas is called Manassas. It should be called Bull Run. I mean, Manassas is the Confederate name, and that in the state of Virginia, when this was created, we named it after that. And then there is Jack Jackson, the steroidal Jackson on the Manassas battlefield, on the Bull Run. I'm not going to call it Manassas. On the Bull Run, has anybody seen Jack Jackson? I mean, he looks like Schwarzenegger. And it was put there by the state of Virginia in 1940, clearly lost cause. There's some at Shiloh that are lost cause. There are some on this battlefield that are clearly lost cause. I had a student that went and looked at the North Carolina and Virginia monuments here, went and read the speeches. It's total lost cause white supremacist stuff when they were put in. Absolutely. So what does that mean? Well, as I went and did the thing, there's nothing that puts this in context on those battlefields. Not a darn word puts in context that these were done for lost cause, that the speeches were about lost cause. That it was done during a time of lynching, of disenfranchisement, of all the other things that had this. The interesting thing about the battlefield is that these battlefields have become American sacred space. They are sacred in a way that even the Capitol isn't. I mean, we just removed Robert E. Lee from the Capitol, from the Statuary Hall. Yet Alexander Stephens is still there. Jefferson Davis is still there. So I wish, if it were up to me, there should be a commission like the one I'm on for this. There should be a National Park Service or Department of Interior commission that should look at this issue in a holistic way and come up with this. So, for instance, I was just at the Robert E. Lee Memorial. Anybody know where the Robert E. Lee Memorial is? That's Arlington. Arlington House is called the Robert E. Lee Memorial. When was it named? 1955. Reaction to Brown versus the Board of Education. So we've got to be honest about these things. And we're not, to me, there isn't an honesty because there isn't an understanding. I have never been to another battlefield that had the same level that made things equal that this battlefield does. It's as though blue and gray are equal. And to me, they are fundamentally, especially in Pennsylvania, fundamentally unequal. And what that means in the future, I don't know. I don't know if I've studied enough, but how has this become sacred ground, and what should we do about that so that we have a more fundamental understanding? So we understand that the UDC put up the Alabama and the North Carolina and what that means and why they did it. Remember that the lost cause has a purpose. Confederate monuments, lost cause ideology, new constitutions, disenfranchisement, white terror through lynching are the pillars of a racial police state, an apartheid state that was created in the South in the early part of the late part of the 19th, early part of the 20th century to ensure white political power at the expense of black people. That's what we got to know.
So we'll make a couple plugs. One, I hope you can join us again tomorrow at 1:30 for the next installment of the Winter Lecture Series. I will say Robert E. Lee and Me is available in the Park Bookstore. It's also available on Audible, which I just found out.
Did you know? I tell you, I got to give it to the narrator.
Yes, great
there
narrator.
As well. I did the narrating.
Thank you again. Have a good day. Have a safe day.
Oh, thank you.